in person and to our online audience. We're so pleased to have you join us for this mayoral forum, which features candidates and, as I mentioned, a live in-person audience, which is so exciting. My name is Seth Pinsky. I'm the CEO of the 92nd Street Y, and I'm honored to host this forum live from the stage of the 92nd Street Y's historic Kaufmann Concert Hall. The forum is the latest installment of our Race to City Hall Civic series, which features substantive conversations with candidates for top New York City elected offices. Tonight, we're going to be speaking, as all of you know, with candidates for the mayor. This is the top job in a city that right now is dealing with multiple crises, from addressing historic injustices to keeping New Yorkers healthy and safe, to dealing with an economic crisis of historic proportions. And that crisis, of course, has affected our sector here at the 92nd Street Y, the arts and cultural sector, in really deep and meaningful ways. So given the importance of this conversation, I want to start as soon as possible. But before doing so, I did just want to thank our media partners, PIX11 and City and State New York. And speaking of City and State New York, I have sitting next to me City and State New York's president and publisher, Tom Allen, who will help frame our conversation.
Great, thanks, Seth. Thanks to you and to the Y for collaborating on this series, and to PIX11 for their media partnership. In just a few moments, a moderated forum between leading mayoral candidates will begin. The questions were designed by political journalists from City and State New York and from PIX11, who also incorporated questions that were submitted by 92nd Street Y patrons in advance of the event. We will hear more about our moderators and the format rules in a moment. But first, as a leader of a journalism institution, I can't help but not use this opportunity to ask you, Seth, the leader of an arts and cultural institution, a few questions. What has the last year been like for you as a performance, arts, and education institution?
Well, clearly, in many ways, it's been a devastating year for us and for our entire sector. I think the statistics are that at the height of the pandemic last year, the city had lost something like 20% of all jobs, and about 30% of those had been recovered by the end of the year. In the arts and cultural sector, the equivalent figures were 68% of all jobs were lost, and only 5% of those jobs had been recovered by the end of the year. And it was really a double whammy for us in that not only were all of us forced to close our doors, losing revenues, but also our donors were significantly impacted, so that safety net, which normally exists, in many ways disappeared for us also. For us at the 92nd Street Y, we had to make some very difficult decisions with respect to our staff. We had to make difficult decisions about programming. But what I will also say on the positive side is that we were forced to really reevaluate how we do everything. We decided to put all of our programming online over the course of the year after the pandemic. We created about 1,700 original programs online. And we were able to generate 4 million views, which for an institution that normally welcomes about 300,000 people through its doors was an incredible opportunity for us to touch people. We touch people in over 200 countries in all 50 states. And so now, as we're beginning to welcome people back through our doors, this audience being an example of that, our hope is that in addition to creating the community that we always have had here in person, that we're going to be able to stay in touch with this new global audience that we have, and to be able to bring our mission and to impact people in a way that's even broader than we were able to do before the pandemic.
Gotcha. Well, why is the recovery of these sectors so important to sort of average New Yorkers? Why would they care about it?
Well, I spent a number of years in economic development in the Bloomberg administration, and what I came to appreciate in that role was that the arts and culture sector affects the city in 3 different ways. First of all, and maybe most importantly, it provides the city with its soul. It touches us with beauty. It forces us to look at the world in different ways. It challenges us intellectually. And that probably alone would be reason enough that New Yorkers should care about arts and culture. But for people who are maybe less sentimental, there are a couple of other reasons why the sector is important. The first is that the sector is an enormous economic engine in and of itself. Before the pandemic, the creative industries in New York accounted for almost 300,000 jobs and generated $30 billion in wages, which are about 12% of all wages generated in the creative industries in the entire country. And by some measures, about 15% of New York City's total economic output, or about $100 billion, is generated by the creative industries. So as an economic engine, the arts and cultural sector is an important one for us. But in addition to that, the arts and cultural industry play a role that is almost unique in the larger economy. And to understand that, you need to understand what it is that has been behind the success of New York's economy over the last 15 or 20 years. And the key to New York's success has been our diverse and talented workforce. And that diverse and talented workforce has attracted industries and businesses to New York, which in turn have attracted more talent to New York, and so on in a virtuous cycle. The reason why we've been able to build the talented workforce that we have in New York is because of what I like to refer to as our magnetic infrastructure, the things that make living in a city that's dirty, that's loud, that's expensive, worth doing. And a key part of that magnetic infrastructure is our arts and cultural sector. And so as our mayoral candidates begin to think about how our city can recover going forward, and as the electorate of New York begins to think about that, a key component of that is going to be figuring out how to attract and retain that workforce, and arts and culture is a key part of that.
Are there other key issues that about reopening that the mayoral candidate should be talking about?
Well, I guess I would say that there are, there's a long list, but there are at least 4 things that I would hope that the mayoral candidates would think about when contemplating how they can assist our sector. The first, and I'm just going to give these as illustrations, there's obviously much more than just these 4 things, but the first is that the pandemic was financially devastating to us and to our peers. And so certainly financial support, something that we are seeing from the federal government and to an extent from the state and city, that's critical. And while it would be important for an organization like us, it's particularly important for small to mid-size arts and cultural institutions, especially those that are outside of Manhattan in the neighborhoods around the city. The second is, I would say that it's important for candidates to remember that in many ways, the challenges that we're facing are similar to the challenges that all businesses in New York are facing. And so figuring out how to continue to make New York a place that people want to come to live, that they want to come to work, that they want to come to visit, that's critical for our survival, because we need the New Yorkers who live in our neighborhood to continue to come and appreciate the programs that we have, but we also need commuters from the suburbs. We need tourists from outside of the area to come and participate in our programming. Similarly, I would say that another area for the mayoral candidates to think about is that in many ways, arts and cultural organizations are businesses. And like with many businesses, we interact with the city on many different levels. Many arts organizations get money from the city. We have to get permits in order to operate. And frankly, it's very, very challenging to deal with New York City's bureaucracy, and it's only gotten more challenging over time. And certainly figuring out ways to treat us as if we're partners rather than parties to be squeezed would be of help. And then the last thing that I would say is that for us to survive going forward, we need to make sure that we have audiences and that we're cultivating an interest in literacy in the arts among young people. And we at the 92nd Street Y provide arts education to about 16,000 low-income students in the public schools of New York, but the need is much greater. And so thinking about arts education as something that's not a luxury, but is part of a basic education is something that would also be helpful to us and all arts organizations, and frankly, I think would be helpful to us as a society. So those are 4 ideas.
Great. Thanks, Seth. Thanks for teeing that up. Now I'd like to introduce City and State's Editor-in-Chief, Ralph Ortega, who will tell us more about the rules, the format, and our moderators, And last but not least, introduce the candidates to the stage. Ralph, over to you.
Thank you, Tom, Seth. That brief exchange was a great way to kick off this evening's discussion. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to welcome the candidates to the 92nd Street Y and all the viewers watching here in person and online to our mayoral forum, our mayoral candidates forum. Both the in-person audience and the candidates have followed our COVID-19 protocols today, and we appreciate everyone's effort to participate safely. First, I'll explain the format, which all the candidates have agreed to in advance of today's event. In just a moment, candidates will take positions on the stage at the podiums and engage in a three-part forum consisting of an opening question, followed by a series of critical policy questions, followed finally by a closing question. For opening and closing questions, candidates will have 1 minute to deliver their responses for the main policy questions. Candidates will initially have 1 minute each to answer, and with time remaining, our moderators will ask follow-ups and facilitate our conversation. Our moderators will remind our candidates how much time each one has to respond and when their time has elapsed. Our three moderators, as a reminder to our in-person audience, please remain respectful during the forum, as we have limited time and want to ensure that all the candidates have an equal opportunity to speak. Our three moderators for today's forum have impressive careers in political reporting and have been closely following New York City's local elections. The questions were designed by the moderators, and they incorporated themes submitted to the 92nd Street Y in advance of this event. They are Jeff Colton, senior reporter at City and State New York; Ayanna Harry, Emmy Award-winning reporter from PIX11; and Ben Adler, senior editor at City and State New York. Thank you to all three of you for being here this evening. Now, let's welcome our candidates to the stage. Please hold your applause until the end. Attending today's forum, in person, Maya Wiley. Shawn Donovan. Diane Morales. Catherine Garcia. And Ray McGuire. Welcome, candidates. Thank you for coming in person this evening.
Thank you for having us in person this evening.
We're looking forward to having all of you answer our questions, and we hope that you all enjoy this presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff Colton.
Sure. So we invited the 8 leading candidates to join us today, and we're so thrilled that you 5 could join us this evening. I was here in this very theater some years ago watching Preet Bharara talk to Tom Wolfe about the Bonfire of the Vanities. But cool events like that and other things hosted by the 92nd Street Y haven't been happening much in the past year because of this global pandemic. So as sort of an opening question, giving you all 1 minute, we're going to start with Ray McGuire. I'd like you to talk about how you're going to continue bringing back New York City from this global pandemic with a special focus on revitalizing arts, educational, and cultural institutions like the 92nd Street Y and so many partners here. So I'll hand it off to Ray.
So thank you for having me. And how will we revive? You know, I've been involved in the arts education, the cultural institutions here for almost 4 decades. And so it is very clear to me, my life has been committed to that. And if we are to make certain that New York City's best days are ahead of us as opposed to behind us, we need to invest and continue to invest in the revitalization of the arts. So at the core of what I do. And what the city needs is the leadership that is focused on the arts and recognize the importance of arts around the city, not only the larger cultural organizations, but the smaller ones as well. And today, we have not invested as much as we need to. I have a track record of having invested. from arts education, from Harlem School of the Arts to figure skating in Harlem to the new museum, International Center for Photography, chair of the board of the Studio Museum, sit on the board of Museum of Natural History, have invested in arts and arts education, which is fundamental to the city, not only commercially, but it's also, most importantly, as the great William Faulkner says, it's part of our humanity. It allows us not only to endure, but to prevail. And as the great John Keats says, beauty is truth and truth is beauty. That's all you know on earth and that's all you need to know. That's the arts, and that's why we need to focus on the arts.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. We're actually not going in order.
Okay.
We did a random order, so we're going to tell you as we go. But next up is Diane Morales.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, everybody. So, in terms of the arts, I think we talk a lot about the need for us to get back to where things were. I think it's actually important for us to recognize that, yes, we need to revive the arts. However, we actually have to address the equity and representation issues in the arts. I think it's important for us to make note of the We See You White American Theater movement, which is a group of folks that have actually stepped out in terms of addressing and calling out the inequities in terms of theater here in the city and beyond. I also think one of the things that we focus on a lot in terms of the arts and culture is the idea of economic revival and the sort of the theater arts. I think it's also important for us to recognize the role that the arts have to play in healing for our city. Arts in schools, arts for seniors, which, by the way, increases life expectancy significantly, and the need to actually also protect and support our workers. So I think it's important for us to invest in the arts. We need to invest in bringing back the arts in a different kind of way. The cultural institutions groups, we know 35 of them are responsible for 80% of the city funding.
Thank you, Ms. Morales.
And we need to address that moving forward as well.
Thank you very much. Next up, for 1 minute, Maya Wiley.
Well, thank you. And I really want to start this by saying I do have a plan on arts and culture, but I also want us to recognize what it means to think about how we recover all our people. Because a 10-year-old boy, Justin Wallace, was shot and killed just a few days ago. And at the same time, we saw riot-geared police officers clearing a public park and doing it in a way that is devastating for police and community relationships, and certainly not spending our dollars and recognizing that the community in Far Rockaway, where Justin Wallace lived, is a community that does not have enough arts and education in the schools, and where the schools are overcrowded, and where it's easier to get a gun than a job. And so we have to address that and recover every last one of our people in this city. And my arts and culture plan does just that, just as Seth Pinsky pointed out, $100 million in resources that we will use as grants for artists and for arts houses all over the city.
Thank you. Next up is Shawn Donovan.
Thank you, Jeff. It is so wonderful to be here. I remember being in this very theater just before the pandemic shut down New York, and this is a hopeful moment where we can begin to reimagine our city reopening. But at the same time, we do have to remember that we still have more than 500,000 New Yorkers that are out of work. And recovering our arts, just as Seth said, to rebuild our souls, but also to rebuild our economy, is incredibly important. And as a kid growing up in this city, I'll never forget the I Love New York campaign. We need a new I Love New York campaign at this moment to let every New Yorker know our arts are back, but also everyone around the world to come back. We also need to make sure that we're focusing on this New Deal moment. This is an opportunity to help our artists, to help our institutions, particularly our smaller institutions, to invest in reopening. I would take every vacant storefront, our public spaces around the city, fill them with arts, particularly help our smaller institutions and our artists, partnering with the Biden administration, from my experience, to make sure we're investing in our communities and rebuilding arts at the center of our economic recovery.
Thank you. And last for the opening is Catherine Garcia.
Thank you, Jeff, and I am thrilled to be here as well in person. It is a very optimistic sign for the future. Art and culture have to be at the core of how we come back, because we know that we are in competition with other cities right now for people. And that means that we need to have a more livable city. Because when we have a more livable city, then we keep people here, we bring people here, and people want to visit here. And that is why arts and culture has to lead the way. We have to do things like make it so when we put money in the capital budget for arts institutions, they can actually spend it. That when the Save Our Stages money is available, that it is going equitably across the city. And I have identified over $200 million that will be invested in the public school system for art and culture and music, because our children need to be educated not just on reading and writing and math, but on everything that makes us human, so that they can use their creativity to come out of this pandemic strongly.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Thank you. Over to Ayanna.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good to see you.
It's great to see all of you in person. This is such an important and exciting time for the city that we love. We appreciate you being here with us tonight in person. I know it's a little bit busy, something coming up in 2 weeks or so. So we really, truly thank you all for being here. So I'm going to dive in with the next question, and I want to talk to you all about climate change for a little bit. So here's the question. Please list 3 specific actions you would take or policies you would put in place during your administration to begin slowing the rate and the effects of climate change here in New York City. So again, looking for 3 specific steps you would take or policies you would put in place. You will have 60 seconds, each of you, for this question, and we are beginning this round with Mr. Shawn Donovan.
Thanks, Ayanna. And look, my son Milo turns 22 today. And he works on climate, he studied it in school, he's working on it now. He reminds me every single day that this is not some distant threat. This is here and it is now. As we saw with Hurricane Sandy, we must make sure that we become the leading climate city in the world again, just like we were under Mayor Bloomberg. And so here's what I would do. First, we have to invest in the 21st century energy and infrastructure that will take us to the forefront on climate change again. We have an enormous opportunity with wind power coming to our East Coast to make sure that New York is the center of jobs, building out that infrastructure. Second, our biggest source of carbon emissions is our buildings. Local Law 97 is actually one of the leading building laws in the world, but we haven't implemented it in a way that partners with building owners and with residents with PACE loans and other investment that can actually get those improvements done. And then finally, I would create a New York City Climate Corps that puts people to work, particularly in Black and brown communities that have been hardest hit by the climate crisis over and over again.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I have a quick 30-second follow-up. I know you are the man with plans, right? So how do you get everyday New Yorkers to buy into your plan for climate change? Please tell us in 30 seconds.
Well, here's the thing. As I travel around the city, having worked to lead the recovery from Hurricane Sandy for President Obama, I know that more and more people see this threat as real, and they particularly feel it and see it in our most vulnerable communities. You know, those who are most vulnerable before a crisis are always hurt the worst by it. And so I think we need to start focusing in those communities, rebuilding infrastructure, bringing them to the table, and planning how we rebuild our shorefronts and our communities to make them safer.
Thank you. And next we will turn to Ms. Wiley. Same question for you. How do you tackle climate change? Some concrete steps you take during your administration. 60 seconds.
So look, let's start with recognizing that we can get to net zero, but we don't get there if we ignore all the people of this city, including communities like Mott Haven that has 21 times the rate of asthma than any other community in this city, if we ignore them as solutions to the problem. So I've got a climate justice platform worked on with the environmental justice community, but let's start with $3 billion in my New Deal New York plan, which is for resiliency projects. We've got 66% of our folks in flood zones, 520 square miles, that are people of color and low-income people. So we're going to focus there, but we're also going to make sure that in doing that, we're doing local targeted hiring. So the folks who need the jobs are also getting the jobs, making sure we're resilient. But we're also going to have an asthma action plan. And I'm creating an office of open space management to de-silo government so that we can double the amount of public space. Renewable energy, that's it.
Thank you.
I got it. Got a plan.
So you mentioned Mott Haven. It's a community we at PIX11 have done several stories on, a lot of challenges there. How do you create more green spaces in city communities like Mott Haven?
So you start with partnering with the community and getting city government agencies to partner with others. I've spent a lot of time there. One of the things that was clear is, for example, the initiative that enabled restaurants to pour out into the streets was very helpful in helping some of those restaurants survive. The problem was it wasn't organized in a way, and we had one restaurant owner said, every time I spent thousands of dollars to put up a structure on the street, I got fined. Rather than having a city government that came to me and said, let's talk about what we do with open streets, where we find our park spaces, where we can create more space, city-owned land, we work together and we partner.
Thank you, thank you. Next we're turning to Mr. McGuire. How are you this evening?
How are you?
I'm good. So the question again is just, I'm looking for a few specific ideas on how you would address climate change, some specific action steps while you're mayor.
So climate is an essential component of what I call the greatest, most inclusive economic comeback in the history of New York City. 500,000 jobs. Go big, go small, go forward. Go big, infrastructure and specific. One of the components of that is dealing with the 100-year flood that comes every 5 years. Hunch Point, Coney Island, Lower Manhattan, City Island, Red Hook. We need to focus on making sure that the climate resiliency about which we have advertised and issued press releases and about which we've done nothing, we need to start doing something today. That's part of my economic comeback plan. That's number one. Number two, to get to net zero, we need to focus on green spaces, streetscapes. I would focus on making sure that we have more green spaces. And in addition to that, where we don't have the green spaces, let's make sure that we invest in those green spaces. Another component of that, another component is what I call point of demand delivery services. Rather than having the large semi-trucks come in during the course of the day, let's deposit at garages, which today may be somewhat unutilized. Let's have them deposit at the garages and then use the latest technology that's climate-friendly technology to go the last mile.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Quick 30-second follow-up question for you. How would you encourage city agencies to reduce the volume of waste they produce?
So I would have a scorecard that went by agency, identified what the climate-friendly metrics are, and let's have a public scorecard to make sure we keep tabs on that, and then let's incentivize by creating some kind of competition.
Thank you. And next I'll ask the question to Ms. Garcia, a few steps you would take as mayor to begin slowing the rate and effects of climate change here in New York City. 1 minute.
You know, climate change is really the existential crisis of our time. In the last year, California burned, Texas froze. We know that it is coming, that it is here now. That is why I have supported the Renewable Rikers Plan, which will turn it into an island with solar and wind power and battery backup, as well as compost, so that we can have citywide collection of food scraps. But we also need to ditch diesel, particularly for those who are youngest among us. That means 10,000 school buses will get electrified, that we will do the Green New Deal for NYCHA, and that we will complete 150 million square feet of new green space. And that is why I have been endorsed by the League of Conservation Voters, because I not only have a plan, but I know how to actually get it done.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. You mentioned a Renewable Rikers Plan. What's the price tag on that, and where would the funds come from?
So the Renewable Rikers Plan is still being priced out, as you know, but the funds will come through the city's capital budget. We have a $118 billion capital budget, and these are the right investments to make because they will save us money in the long run. And we also need to meet the requirements of Local Law 97. If we don't have clean power in the city to make up for the 40% that we spend on fuel oil for heating and hot water, We won't get there.
Thank you so much. And finally, Ms. Morales, the same question to you. I'm just looking for a few ways in which, as mayor, you would work to address the impact of climate change in New York City. 60 seconds.
Sure. So we all have to be concerned about the climate crisis, and we also have to recognize that the climate crisis is not impacting all of us equally. I spent the last decade working in the South Bronx, helping students and families who were disproportionately being impacted by asthma as a result of the environmental issues, therefore missing school, therefore also using the emergency rooms as primary care. We need to move forward to address those things. The other thing I did was I was on the front lines of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. I saw the devastation that this inflicted on the community. We need to move forward in a way that is aggressive and also addresses the issue while creating jobs. So that is why I've called for the creation of the Urban Climate Corps, which would in fact employ folks from the communities that have been most disproportionately harmed so that we can increase resiliency, we can increase green spaces, and we can grow our eco-districts. The other thing I think we need to do is to use the resources that we have. We have CUNY, which is a gem here in the city. We should be using CUNY as a partner in research, in development, in training the folks for the jobs that are necessary, and in helping us to invest in the industrial design process for the city.
Thank you, Ms. Morales. And I have a quick 30-second follow-up. We know that after Superstorm Sandy, so many of our waterfront communities were devastated. So I'd love to hear how you would strengthen the city's resiliency ahead of the next storm. 30 seconds.
Sure. Again, I do believe that we need to actually create jobs to address these issues. We can actually do two things at once. We can both prepare ourselves for the inevitable issues with the climate that we have to address, and also put people to work and begin to re-stimulate our economy in a whole different kind of way. Intro 1620 did a great job in terms of beginning to talk about the resiliency plan and the need to protect our waterfront. We actually need to move, we need to mobilize, we need to employ people, we need to train them, and we need to invest in protecting our waterfront, because we can do two things at once. This is New York City. We're capable of actually giving people jobs and actually preparing ourselves for the future.
Thank you so much for that. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Ben.
Thank you, Ayanna. We're going to switch gears here to a subject that is a little bit less sweeping or global in scope, but that the mayor has a lot of control over, and that's the New York City public school system. Another case in which we've decided the order completely at random, and answers will be limited to 60 seconds, please. According to New York City Department of Education data, the city's public schools are among the nation's most segregated by race and by economic class. The resulting educational inequity has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, as students of color are more likely to face challenges in remote learning. How would you integrate schools, both selective and non-selective, and address the needs of students stemming from the pandemic? That question first goes to Catherine Garcia.
We have seen, particularly during COVID, the exposure of how inequitable our school system is. We have to make significant changes. We have to have a crown jewel school system in order to meet the needs of the 21st century economy. And that is why we got to start young. We need childcare for 0 to 3 for kids who are for parents who are making under $70,000. We need to do away with testing four-year-olds for G&T. We need to make it so that we are eliminating the screens at middle school, like District 15 did very successfully. We need to expand the number of high schools that we have and take the top 10% from every middle school, regardless of the type of middle school. But we also need to move resources out of headquarters. $130 million needs to be moved out of headquarters and into the classroom. This will help us fund the art and culture and music and theater and sports that we know needs to happen, because every kid needs a great start, but then we also need to be planning for them to have a great career.
Thank you, Catherine Garcia. A follow-up to that, you mentioned a number of measures to address the underrepresentation of students of color or from low-income backgrounds in selective schools and gifted and talented programs, but the majority of students don't attend those schools. So what about, how would you integrate those schools, and address the needs. The students who are struggling the most in terms of being left behind in the pandemic are probably not the ones even applying to or going to the selective schools. So how would you address the needs of the most vulnerable and at-risk students?
Look, I want for every New York City school kid what I had growing up, what my parents were able to give me. I'm a product of New York City public schools. I know they can all be great, and we have to make sure that we are investing in all of them. And so that means that we are going to put the funding in those schools to make it so that every child, regardless of where they live, is getting a world-class education. And that is why I've said we would remove the screens at different levels of school, because everyone does go to middle school when it is a lottery. Therefore, we are not taking race into account.
Thank you. Next, we turn to Diane Morales. Same question. How would you integrate the public schools, selective and non-selective, in terms of race and class, and address the needs of students stemming from the pandemic? 60 seconds.
Thank you. So I have to say, as the only former public school teacher in this race, I have a very clear sense of the problems in our schools. I am also the mother of 2 young adults who both had IEPs throughout school. So I have a front row seat on the issues and the challenges with our school system. Let me start off by saying this. Every student is gifted and talented. The job of our teachers and our education system is to make sure that they are helping those students identify and grow and nurture those talents, whether they have an IEP, whether they are speaking English as a second language, whether they are from a low-income background. Our children should not be subjected to a future based on the zip code that they come from. It is possible for New York City to embrace the idea of desegregating all of our schools and elevating the quality of all of our schools so that any family and any student would be proud to attend that. We need to exercise the moral and the political courage to desegregate our schools. That means removing screens and barriers, redrawing district lines, making sure that our schools are fully funded, bringing in culturally responsive curriculum, and bringing in teachers that reflect the children of the student body, as well as supporting teachers with the tools that they need to better address our students' needs.
Thank you. In terms of the agenda you just laid out, if you got rid of G&T and similar programs, magnet schools and so forth, a lot of people say that parents with academically gifted children and the means to do so will leave the New York City public school system, whether by moving elsewhere or sending them to private school or something. How do you respond to that?
I respond to that by saying that we need to actually make sure that we have a system that works for everybody, not just the select few, and that the scenario that you're referencing actually happens already. The key to helping parents feel like they want their children to be in schools, in our public school system, is by increasing the quality of all of our public schools. It is not by catering to a small group of people in small classes or small schools that are not available to everyone. We actually have to elevate, we have to lift the floor and make sure that every classroom in New York City is one that is providing quality education to all of our students.
Thank you. Okay. Next, Shawn Donovan. We have the same question for you. How would you integrate schools, selective and non-selective, and address students who fell behind during the pandemic?
So as I was walking into the theater tonight, a mom walked up to me with her son and said, "You're going to get the schools open safely, right?" And so first it has to begin with making sure our schools are open, that they're safe, and that they're safe in every community. And I'd work with parents and teachers to do exactly that. But this question is right on target because we can't just build back to the old status quo. We have to recognize that the devastation of the past year has fallen disproportionately on our communities of color. And so one of my ideas is to create an education recovery corps. Let's get our young people who are out of work, our CUNY students, our teachers of the future, working side by side with our teachers in the classroom to work on not just academic recovery, but social and emotional recovery. Let's get broadband into every single school, make sure it's affordable for every family. Let's make sure that we're working with communities, just like in Park Slope and other districts, on weighted lotteries and other ways to make sure our schools are more equitable. And finally, let's better connect our schools to jobs. I have a plan that every high school student in this city would have at least one paid internship or apprenticeship before they graduate. And that's how we're going to make sure that everybody in this city can have an economic future of opportunity.
You mentioned District 15 in Brooklyn's integration program. That is a model for integrating schools within a sufficiently diverse district. But only about a third of New York City's 50 or so public school districts have the diversity that you would need to implement a program like that. What is your proposal to integrate the rest of the districts?
Well, first of all, that would create significantly more opportunity for kids of color. And we need to make sure that we're doing that. We also need to make sure in a city where fewer than 45% of our teachers are teachers of color, when 85% of our kids are kids of color. And we know that if you're a student of color, you have a teacher of color by third grade, that you're much more likely to graduate and succeed. So we need to do a lot more, not just to recruit, but also retain teachers of color in our system. And the other thing we need to do, there's nothing wrong with New York that can't be solved by what's right with New York. We have great both screened and unscreened schools that are academically successful and are also integrated.
I'm sorry.
We need to create more of them in every neighborhood in the city.
Thank you. This next same question, 60-second response is to Maya Wiley. How would you integrate schools and make up for the learning lost in the pandemic?
Well, first let me start by saying I went to a segregated, overcrowded, underfunded black elementary school when I was young. And it is the experience, one of the experiences for which I went to law school to be a civil rights attorney. And from the ACLU and other NAACP Legal Defense Fund fighting for education equity, and proud to have co-chaired the School Diversity Advisory Group with so many other wonderful people. But look, let's be clear. We need to end all discriminatory admissions processes. If it discriminates, we got to get rid of it. And we need to have leadership right now that has the courage to say that we can be compassionate and smart and recognize that all our kids can learn. But that also means recognizing that what we've been doing is testing for resources, not gifts and talents. And we have so many children that don't have families that have the opportunity to invest in them. So one of the things I'm going to do is hire 2,500 more teachers to bring class sizes down, focused on particularly early childhood through K through 12, and we're going to have arts education and trauma counseling in schools.
Thank you very much. You just mentioned trauma counseling. That's one thing that does speak to the COVID part of the question. But in terms of the academic challenges that a lot of students have now, what is your plan for addressing?
Well, so first we have to recognize that our kids are able to learn, and when they are behind, it doesn't mean that they can't do accelerated learning. There are models for this in other parts of the country, and actually in some of our own programs in the city, but we don't lift them up and help and support our teachers and educators to learn from them and support the expansion. So I'm going to create a resource center for teachers and principals to come together to learn those models and actually support their expansion, give more innovation opportunity for our teachers and our principals to innovate in the schools, because right now what we do is we strangle that from them, and it's part of what pushes them out of the system.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Last, we have Ray McGuire. Mr. McGuire, what would you do to integrate schools and address the challenges stemming from the pandemic in the school?
You know, this is deeply personal to me. Education is the only way I got here, through the sacrifices of my single mother. Today, we're in the middle of a crisis, and all of what we've spoken, you've heard, is interesting, but it's whistling past the graveyard. If I randomly take 10 black and brown boys and girls in the 4th grade, 2, maybe 3 can read. 7 out of 10 black and brown boys, 3rd to 8th grade, and girls, 3rd to 8th grade, 7 out of 10 below proficient. We cannot continue this random pre-K through 12 where we rank 19th in the country and spend more than anybody else. We need to start early. I have a plan, cradle to career. Affordable child care from 0 to 3. Pre-K is fine, but by the time many of our kids get to pre-K, they're already behind. I want to start there. By the time they get to pre-K, they're on. Make certain that we get the right professional to assess our children, to understand just how gifted and talented they are early. And then what I want to do is I want to make certain that by the end of the 3rd grade, every child in New York City can read and do math. Why is that? Because between 0 and the end of the 3rd grade, our children are learning to read. After that, they're reading to learn. We need to completely transform the system.
Thank you. In terms of what you're describing is investment in that might improve equity in the sense of improving the conditions for students who are currently disadvantaged. But what about integration and just the fact that the schools, are overwhelmingly segregated by race?
Listen,
how would you
integration will not get us there alone. We need to get the best district schools. We need to get the best magnet schools. We need to get the best parochial schools, and we need to get the best charter schools. This has got to be about the children. And in 1954, the same day that same year Brown versus Board of Education was handed down, we started the segregation of neighborhoods about an hour and a half from here in a place called Levittown. The reason Thurgood Marshall and Charlie Hamilton Houston decided to go desegregation in schools versus desegregation in neighborhoods is because of no school. They knew that school desegregation was going to be a much easier, although still difficult way to go. Integration is not going to solve it. We cannot mathematically integrate to solve the crisis today.
Thank you. Thank you all for your answers, and I'm going to turn it back to Jeff.
Thank you very much, Ben. So, Gowanus, Soho, Inwood, rezonings have been one of Mayor de Blasio's tools to address the housing crisis and to encourage more building. But of course, all those rezonings have caused some of the biggest debates in the past 8 years here in the city. So another question, we'll start with Diane Morales here, is would you support zoning changes to encourage the development of mixed income housing, including in more affluent neighborhoods? And even, would you continue doing that even in the face of expected opposition from local community groups?
So I fundamentally don't believe that the problem with our rezoning is the community. I think it is the way we have done it, the process by which we have done it, the lack of engagement, real engagement of the community, the idea of having for-profit developers leading that process and presenting the plans to the community as if it were a fait accompli, rather than actually genuinely engaging the community. We have got to co-create the communities that we want, that we deserve, and that we need. That means re-examining the Euler process, which is right now fundamentally flawed and does not allow the communities to have the voice that they need in terms of self-determination and looking at what is happening. We also need to actually prioritize affordable housing, truly affordable housing. That means looking at our vacant lots. That means looking at our vacant spaces. That means establishing community land trusts so that we are making sure that we are prioritizing all city-owned public land for the use of housing that is really affordable, that is co-created with communities so that we can actually build communities that work for everyone.
Thank you. I guess is your fundamental philosophy here, do you think that these neighborhoods would, if you plan with them, accept more housing, or are you okay with some neighborhoods saying, no, we do not want housing?
So I think that it is important for us to really give the communities a sort of leading role in this process, but we have to look at it within the context of the citywide landscape, right? We have to look at what the distribution and the allocation of resources and housing is as is, so that we are moving towards an equitable distribution of affordable housing across the city, because what we know right now is that there has been an increased density in some of our lowest income communities of lower income housing. And that needs to be addressed with a sort of comprehensive, holistic plan that does give the community a critical voice in the process, but that is keeping the longer term goal of equity upmost.
Thank you very much. Next question to Ray McGuire, and same one, would you encourage zoning to would you implement zoning to encourage mixed income housing in more affluent neighborhoods?
The answer is I would do as I have done in managing a large business. I would institute a process whereby I would go by borough. I would outline a process where we'd go through an equitable observation about zoning. I would get the community boards involved. I would outline a process that would filter up. We'd get the right experts in place to make sure that we've done it equitably across the boroughs, but it would start with the community. And yes, I would have a process, and yes, that process would be inclusive, and yes, that process would finally determine how we're going to have equitable zoning across the 5 boroughs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess kind of same follow-up there. I mean, if certain neighborhoods say we don't want housing here, even if that doesn't fit into your equitable framework, would you then push against that?
So it does fit into my equitable framework, given the process that I've outlined. So it starts with the communities. We'll have a group of experts who are involved. Community gets a voice. And so the answer is yes, it would be equitable, and yes, the communities would be involved. And the answer is not everybody's going to agree, which is where leadership comes in. A leader who's going to be held accountable has to cast the final vote. That vote will include, by definition, the voices of those whose lives are the most impacted, but leaders got to lead and have to have a vision as to how the city is going to evolve and be inclusive in this evolution and be equitable in how we think about housing. Truly affordable housing, not that which we have built over the past 7-8 years, which has not been truly affordable.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Over to Catherine Garcia. Thoughts on rezoning to encourage development?
We have to be a city that is growing. We have to be a city that is creating more housing, that is creating more jobs, because we have been in a scarcity model since 1946, which makes it more expensive for everyone. I believe that we do need to center community in the process of rezonings, but with the goal of actually achieving a certain number of affordable housing units or a certain number of square footage for new businesses. Because I am open to, we'd like it here, we'd like to have a park or a school as part of this planning, but every rezoning that happens is about homes for people who might be homeless today. It is about making it so that there are job opportunities for people who might not have jobs today. And that is why I have been supportive of the Gowanus rezoning in Brooklyn, which is just literally a few blocks from my house. And this is why the Daily News and the New York Times endorsed me, because I have a track record of working with communities and solving the tough problems so that we can have a more livable New York City.
Thank you. Now, I've heard candidates at all levels this year talk about converting current hotels into, many say, permanent housing. I'm wondering if you've spoken on that. What are your thoughts about converting current hotels into supportive housing or housing in general?
Look, I am very open to making sure we have no quote-unquote stranded assets as we come out of COVID. I'm optimistic that the tourists are coming back, but if there are hotels that are going to be vacant, that they must be converted into permanent housing with services on site and in locations that have strong transit and access to schools. We cannot put families in areas where you can't go get a job or you can't access a local school.
Thank you very much. Over to Shawn Donovan next. Your thoughts on rezoning in affluent areas to encourage development.
Thanks, Jeff. Growing up in this city, I saw homelessness exploding on our streets. I saw communities like the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn literally burning to the ground. And that was what lit a fire in me to go to work on behalf of this city that I love. I've spent 30 years working on housing and homelessness, and it began back then working with community organizations like Nos Quedamos in the South Bronx, Bishop Johnny Ray Youngblood and East Brooklyn congregations in Brooklyn, to make sure that revitalization of communities happened with and for those communities, not to them. So what we need to get these rezonings done, and I do support building more affordable housing across the city, is to work with communities to plan it in a way that it works, that it preserves the character of our neighborhoods, but also builds more affordable housing. But let's back up and just look at the fact we have more homeless people in the city than any time since the Depression. We need to keep people in their homes, protect where they're living today, get them rental assistance. We need to preserve the affordable housing that we have in public housing. And we need to finally solve homelessness. That's what I've done for 30 years, and that's what I could do as mayor.
I know that a lot of the upzonings historically, especially during the Bloomberg administration, have gone with upzonings in certain areas and then kind of paired with downzonings in certain areas that want to keep their neighborhoods the same. Wondering if that's would be your philosophy as mayor, pairing these upzonings to encourage new development with downzoning that would keep some areas less dense.
Well, as I said earlier, we need to work directly with communities. There are historic preservation areas. There are areas of our city where we do need to make sure we're focused on preserving the character. But that doesn't mean we can't find places to build and to create more affordable housing. You mentioned hotels earlier. This is a moment where, post-pandemic, we're going to live and work differently. We may go into the office 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. There's an opportunity to convert office space to affordable housing in much of the city. This is what we did after 9/11, working with Mayor Bloomberg to ensure that downtown became a 24/7 neighborhood. That's the kind of innovation we need at this moment.
And finally, over to Maya Wiley.
Well, look, every single New Yorker should be able to afford the rent. And right now, even before COVID, 45% of New Yorkers were paying more than they should, more than 30% of what they got paid. And that means that we have to recognize we can't go back to January 2020. I will support making sure we have affordability in every community because, frankly, even in the Upper East Side, only 13% affordable units, 19% vacancy because of the costs. But we've got to rethink this too, because I have a plan that says if you earn $54,000 a year or less with a family, then you will not pay more than 30% of your take home because we are going to create a rental subsidy. So we're not pushing people out of homes and making sure they can feed their families and not choose between the rent and a meal. And that's how we're going to do it in addition to building more affordability for the people who really need it.
Thank you. And you mentioned working with community. I mean, again, if certain neighborhoods say, look, we don't want new housing, we don't want affordable housing or anything, do those neighborhoods, do they get a veto, or is this going to be a citywide plan?
Look, we need to have affordability. There's no neighborhood that doesn't need more affordability in this city, but we do have to be principled and we have to be transparent and we have to have a community process and voice. Our current system is not working. It's neither supposed to be reliable to enable community voice and create a reliable process for decision making. It is broken. It doesn't serve either. And so we do need to fix it. And we do have to do longer term planning as well, not just be reactive to one project at a time, but make sure we're parallel tracking that. And that's what I'll do as mayor.
Thank you very much.
I would observe that there's a great project now in the Bronx called the Bronx Commons, where rent goes from $225 a month to the most is $1,999 a month, powered by solar panels, a gymnasium there, with a concert hall, 163rd Street in Melrose. So we can get it done, depending upon the intent and the focus.
I'm fascinated. Thank you. And with
It's actually a project I helped to get done.
I know, Shawn. So. Built everything. So.
And over that to Ayanna, please.
Well, thank you, Jeff. The federal monitor that oversees New York City's jails recently wrote, quote, "The pervasive level of disorder and chaos in the facilities is alarming." What changes should take place within the Department of Correction to help foster better conditions for both officers and inmates? You will have 1 minute, and I'm starting with Ms. Catherine Garcia.
Our correction system is absolutely broken, which is why we need to close Rikers. And you actually talk to correction officers, and they will tell you there's no way to fix it. You can't build a new thing. It needs to be fundamentally changed. This is why, as we think about the future, we will need to build the 4 borough-based jails, but we also need to be focused on diversion, like the Red Hook courts, because that is something that gets people out of the criminal justice system. But backing up, who ends up in the criminal justice system? You know, this was one area where it's very personal to me. Foster care kids who do not end up in permanent families are 50% more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. And I was adopted, as were two of my siblings who are black, and one of them spent 7 years in the foster care system. We don't do right at the beginning, and what we end up is paying for someone to live at Rikers at a cost of more than $400,000 a year. That needs to change.
You mentioned supporting the plan to close Rikers and build those borough-based jails. How do you get those local communities on board? So many of them are pushing back and saying, I don't want a new jail in my community. You have 30 seconds.
Certainly. And so we do need to work with communities, but we also know that there are locations, particularly, for example, in Brooklyn. The Brooklyn House of Detention has been there my entire life. It has not harmed the community whatsoever. You have to show the examples of how it is not going to be a burden. And I have a history of being able to build things that are very challenging and getting them through the process in a way that benefited communities. And so I know that I can build something that is $8 billion worth of construction and ensure that it is done.
Thank you. The same question for you, Mr. McGuire. What kind of changes should happen within the Department of Correction to create better conditions for the officers and for the people, the inmates in our city's jails?
This is yet another crisis that has been exposed and exacerbated by COVID. The system has already been in a state of disrepair, deplorable. It cost us $26,000 a year on average educated child in New York City. It costs us $446,000 a year to keep an inmate at Rikers. 80% of those inmates at Rikers do not have a GED. Between 18 and 24, 1/3 of them read at the 5th grade level. So we need to do something to intervene today. And unless we catch and intervene 90 days after their release, recidivism rates are all too high. We need to invest in the criminal justice system by making certain that we reduce the number. I'm not convinced that there's anywhere that exists in North America, or that matter anywhere in the country, where there's been evidence that a vertical jail has been successful. We're not managing Rikers successfully. There's nothing, no evidence whatsoever that would remotely suggest that we can manage 4 vertical jails any better. We need to find a way, but I'm not convinced that 4 vertical jails and closing Rikers is the way.
So if you're not convinced that closing Rikers is the way, are you then saying we should perhaps keep Rikers? And if so, how do you transform the jail so that we don't continue to see the same issues come up over and over and over again for generations?
So let me be clear. Closing Rikers, yes, but let's find a solution. I'm not convinced that 4 vertical jails is the solution.
So what would be a potential alternative?
So the potential alternatives, which do not exist yet in this country, are ways that we go through and think about how we deal with those who are the most criminally negligent, the most serious criminals amongst us, and put them in jail. So we're not at a point yet where we have the utopian society. It's not clear, given the circumstances that exist today, that we will get there anytime soon. So let's make certain that we do have the jails in place to house those who are a threat to themselves and a threat to all New Yorkers. But I'm not convinced that 4 vertical jails is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. Moving on now next to Ms. Wiley, same question to you. This federal monitor said the level of disorder and chaos in the jails is alarming. What would you do to create better conditions?
Rikers is a human rights violation. It can't be fixed, and it has to be closed. But let's start by remembering who's there. The vast majority of the people who are there have, 1, not been convicted of any crime, and 2, low-level misdemeanor offenses, so many of them. Very few, I forgot the exact percentage, have actually even been accused of a violent crime, and too many can't afford $500, $1,000 bail, which is why they're languishing. So what we have to do is close it. We have to recognize it as the largest psychiatric facility we have in this city, and recognize that rather than a 40% of the folks we have in Rikers, we should be supporting them with mental health services into supportive housing, so that we're not just taking the mentally ill and throwing them in prison. And alternatives to incarceration work. And one thing we should remember, we're all espousing the cure violence model, the violence interruption model, because it works. But those folks were actually people who are effective because they once committed a violent crime and instead they're preventing it. We need a different model.
Thank you. You mentioned we need a different model. What is that model? If Rikers should be closed, what do we do next as a city?
Look, the vast majority of those folks just simply need support services. We know, one, mental health services, as I said, 40% of the folks who are there need mental health services and housing and supportive housing. We've got a way, and I've got a plan to get that done. But we also have to recognize so many people who are there, including Khalif Browder, because he refused to say he was guilty of stealing a backpack and then couldn't afford a few $1,000s bail, languished there for 3 years, and then committed suicide when it was finally determined that it was an injustice. We simply have to be better, and we can be.
Thank you. The same question goes to Ms. Morales. How do we transform and shift what's happening in our city's jails right now?
Well, let me just start by saying this. I spent over 15 years working with folks who are involved in the criminal legal system. So there's nothing justice related about it. And also watched last May 29th as my children actually were pepper sprayed by the NYPD, completely unwarranted. And then a few hours later, my son was assaulted before my eyes by an NYPD officer. So, we can't address these issues in a piecemeal fashion. We cannot address the Department of Corrections without, in fact, facing the reality that our policing system is fundamentally flawed. The other thing that we need to recognize is that the people who are disproportionately impacted by the system not only are dealing with mental health issues, but they also happen to be low-income Black and brown folks. We have the option, we have the opportunity to actually provide services to address people's needs, whether those needs are mental health related, whether those needs are about needing access to a job and providing economic security, or whether those needs are about providing a roof over their head. We have the option to do something different. And now is the time for us to make those choices so that we are addressing the inequities and disparities in our system.
So, Ms. Morales, let me ask you, do you support the current plan on the table to close Rikers and move to borough-based jails?
No, I don't believe that we address a racist, inequitable system by creating nicer jail cells. That is not the way forward for New York City. We should be leading the country, we should be leading the world on what true justice looks like. And justice looks like getting mental health services for someone who is mentally ill. Justice looks like getting a job for someone who is unable to address their family needs. Justice looks like providing housing for someone who is homeless. That's what we can do. We have the resources, we just need the will and the commitment to address these issues at the root, the structural issues and the systemic issues that have resulted in these disparities.
Thank you. And finally, the same question goes to Mr. Donovan. Just taking a look at our jails and the crisis that they're in. As mayor, how would you bring about change?
So, Ayanna, Rikers is a monument to a criminal justice system that doesn't provide justice. And not only would closing it be the humane thing to do, it would also save hundreds of millions of dollars a year that we could invest in our communities. Think about this. We spend over $400,000 per person per year at Rikers right now and get terrible results. And more than half of the folks that are there are suffering from mental illness. And this is not only playing out at Rikers, it's playing out on our streets, in our shelters, on our subways. We have an epidemic of mental health that is happening in this city that we must take on. And here's what we need to do. First, we need to invest in what's called supportive housing. It's permanent housing that provides the services, the mental health services, the substance abuse services on site. And we need to create what's called a coordinated entry system. Anytime someone leaves Rikers or the mental health wing of one of our public hospitals, they're directed immediately into supportive housing. When I was housing commissioner in the city, that's how we reduced the number of people sleeping on our streets and in shelter by 30%.
Thank you.
It's doubled under Mayor de Blasio.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. So you talked about closing Rikers Island. What's the alternative?
Well, like Catherine, I actually live just a few blocks and raised my children from the Brooklyn Detention Center. I think we can provide alternatives that are closer to our courts, that provide real contact for folks that are there with their families, and to do it in a way that brings exactly the kind of services that I'm talking about on site. It's going to take real community-based engagement, but we have to close Rikers. It's the only humane thing to do.
Can I just say one thing, because it's been said so often? The Brooklyn Federal Jail that we're talking about is an awful place too.
Maya, that's
it is
not what we're
simply
talking about.
awful. It went without heat for inmates for a very long time, literally without blankets. It is not an alternative, and what we have to do is have humane ways to take those folks who need to be housed so that they're getting the supports to return to the community.
Can I just show you,
Yes.
that's not the jail I think either Shawn or I were talking about. Brooklyn House of Detention's on Atlantic. The federal jail's in Sunset Park. And you're
Both
correct.
of that, look, the bottom line is we're talking about something that does not work for people. It's not just about whether it's in our communities, it's about whether it's contributing to our problems. So we have a different way to solve them that keeps us safe, but does it in a way that actually fixes what's broken, and that's the courage we need.
Thank
I
you.
do think we
And
can
let me
rebuild
observe-
in a different way that provides the services, the supports that people need. And we have to close Rikers. And the alternative is that if we don't have a real plan, if we don't work with communities, if we don't reimagine what these places can be for our folks, our communities, then we're not going to be able to
But
close
the
Rikers.
alternative does not have to be a different kind of jail cell. The alternative can be access to a life lived in dignity. It could be providing the services and the resources that people need to actually function and take care of their families and be productive members of the community. It's not, the answer is not another jail cell. We're not talking about degrees of humanity here in terms of this jail cell versus that jail cell. We actually need to make the decision that we're going to help provide people with what they need so that they can thrive and they can live in dignity in society. It's not the way to go. This system is based on chattel slavery. We know that.
Let me observe that spending $8 to $10 billion on 4 vertical jails is abject failure of leadership and vision. Simply not the way we ought to go and move this city forward. If you build it, they're going to fill it. Not the way to go. Not the best of New York.
I actually agree with you.
We can do better.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Ayanna. For our last question, once again, going in randomly selected order, we've heard a lot of proposals from all of you tonight that would require approval from the City Council or in some cases from the state government. But as Bill de Blasio can tell you, the council, the state legislature, and especially the governor, don't always give the mayor what he or she wants. So how would you get your agenda approved by the council? And in Albany, first person to answer that will be Maya Wiley. 60 seconds, please.
Well, first of all, I have experience doing just this. Because when I was counsel to the mayor, I was responsible for women and minority-owned business enterprises. That means the contracts we get out to folks who deserve the business, who too often don't get it. But we needed a state law change so that we would have the same powers to get contracts out as the state. So what we did and what I led was a partnership, one with the women and minority-owned businesses themselves, because guess what we share as people who are public servants? The people we serve. It is our obligation, all of us, to serve them and do it in the right way. And having those voices come in and say that they wanted the legislation and have voice and agency, but also having worked in partnership with our delegation to Albany around the priorities and why we wanted them. So we had champions there, but I was also working with my counterpart who was the counsel to the governor. And guess what happens? The staffs work very well together. And we had our back channel to make sure we got that legislation done. And it is about partnership, it is about priorities, and it is about holding people first and foremost.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Next, the question goes to Shawn Donovan. How would you get your agenda approved by the council or, where applicable, the state government?
Well, you know, in so many ways as New Yorkers, whether it's the pandemic, our subways, our schools, we've seen that watching our governor and our mayor behave like toddlers in a sandbox. I'm the father of 2 young boys. I know what that looks like. It has been politics ahead of people. in this city for too long. And so we need a mayor who has the ability to put ego aside, put people first, go to Albany, and be able to get things done. That's a record that I have. When I was housing commissioner in the city, we went to Washington, we negotiated the biggest investment in supportive housing to end homelessness, called the New York 3 agreement, that the city had ever seen. And I was able to get changes in our property tax system to encourage more affordable housing. When I led the recovery from Sandy, I went to Albany, got $60 billion approved quickly from Congress, and put it to work in this city, to work across every agency with the governor, but also with the legislature. That's the record that we need in City Hall to really change the relationship that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Next, the question goes to Catherine Garcia. How would you get your agenda passed?
Yes, the relationship between the state and the city have been quite toxic. And I know that I can bring real change to that relationship, not only about thinking about the governor, but also about our state senate and our assembly, because they also have a supermajority. When I was campaigning with Liz Krueger during this weekend, she had been asked why she'd endorsed me. And it is because we were able to work together even when we disagreed. The same is true at the city council. Some of the most progressive pieces of legislation got done between me and my chair, Antonio Reynoso, whether or not that was creating waste zones for private carters, or whether or not that was reducing waste permits in communities of color. These were hard things to work on, to get done, but we got them passed because I was able to negotiate and do the politics to make it happen.
Thank you. Next, Ray McGuire, how would you get your agenda passed by the City Council and the State?
Yeah, let me just observe, I would respectfully outline, Maya, that the MWBE program that you outlined was not one that benefited to MWBEs. Less than 5% or so of the contracts that went to MWBEs, and with the black and brown businesses, less than 2%. Now, what I would do, given the history that I've had in negotiations, which I've done for the past 4 decades, and in fact led a business who was responsible for negotiating transactions around the world, and I've negotiated, I don't know, somewhere between $650 and $750 billion worth of deals, and I stayed in a leadership role longer than anybody else in the history of corporate America. I know how to bring differing parties together to get to a successful conclusion. And what that includes is identifying those whose lives are going to be the most impacted, get them at the table first, understanding who the most important constituents are, get them to the table first. And one of the things that you should observe about me is that I don't owe any political favors. I'm not beholden to anyone. I'm an outsider, and therefore my sole focus is going to be what's in the best interest of New York City. And if that be the agenda, then the path forward, while difficult, we can achieve. Sole focus, what's in the best interest of New York City.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire.
I'd like to actually just say something about that, since it
very briefly, please.
Very briefly. You know, when I went into City Hall, the city only spent about $500 million in contracts on MWBEs. In 1 year, despite the fact that I had no budget and no staff, I got it up to $1.6 billion because I partnered, matched it the next year. And the reason we know that we didn't do a good enough job with Black and Latino businesses is because I commissioned the disparity study. Because if you don't look for what's broke, you can't fix it, and that's what I did.
Thank you.
You know what that's called? That's called crumbs. And far too long, MWBE's been outside. So when they give us crumbs, they want us to feel full. We shouldn't be interested in the crumbs. Matter of fact, we shouldn't be interested in the cake.
I'm sorry.
It needs to be interested in owning the bakery. So let's
I'm sorry.
I have to
partnering to solve problems, and that's what I'll do as mayor.
Thank you. I think we have to stop it there. Our last question of the evening goes to Diane Morales. How would you get your agenda passed by the council and the state government?
Sure. Listen, we're at a crossroads here. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed and exacerbated the pre-existing pandemics of racism, of classism, of sexism that disproportionately impact so many communities. We have a choice to make here, and I believe that the right choice is to confront the past, to confront our historic, systemic, and structural inequities, and to make a decision that we're not going to just go back to normal. Over the past couple of weeks, people have been starting to talk about, with relief, about how great it is that things are starting to feel normal again. The reality of it is that normal for so many New Yorkers was just not sustainable, was just not bearable, and was just not good enough. I am hopeful that the newly elected city council, which has increasing numbers of folks who want to elevate the collective good, are going to share my vision for the kind of transformation that New York City needs and deserves. I am hopeful that the state legislature, which has passed historic legislation over the last 6 months, will continue in that trajectory. And I am also more than ready to stand up to the governor to advocate for what New Yorkers need and what New Yorkers deserve in a way that we have not had a voice advocating for us so far.
Thank you, Ms. Morales. And thank you to all of the candidates for participating and answering our questions. That concludes our questions for the evening, but to close tonight's event, we're going to turn back to the 92nd Street Y CEO, Seth Pinsky, who will say a few words.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I want to thank all of our candidates for participating in person tonight and for taking our questions. I think we all gained valuable insights into where they stand on so many critical issues for our city, and we appreciate their spending time with us so close to the June 22nd primary. I want also to thank our media partners, City and State New York and PIX11, and in particular their incredible political reporters, Ayanna Harry, Jeff Colton, and Ben Adler, for setting up tonight's compelling and informative discussion. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you, our audience, for coming here tonight in person and for joining us online. We hope you'll continue to check on our website at 92y.org for information about other 92nd Street Y programs and events. And with that, we're signing off. Good night, and thank you again.